this stuff happening. Okay.
So you both are okay with being?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so everyone's ready? Okay, starting now. I affirm part one is a framework. The role of the judge promote critical thinking, which means they must enhance their potential to expose oppressive social biases. Status quo actors who balance smother critical thought by oppression require judges to help make debated police who challenge social norms. Giroux. Totalitarianism, state violence, smother critical thought powers now concentrated in the hands of few people. Ideologies been replaced by the command and certainty backed by militarization, political and ethical ignorance shape life as agency devolves into kind of anti-intellectual foolishness. Education is crucial to overcoming the current crisis. Educators and students need to reclaim education and be critically engaged agents. The role of the ballot is to endorse the autonomous liberation strategy for the oppressed. Autonomous liberation means that marginalized people have the capacity to self-advocate and decide their own forms of liberation. Sharp. A realistic, self-reliant capacity to end oppression not only addresses the current system that also removes credibility from a false claim by the government it's objective to promote greater freedom. He adds this may also help people develop their knowledge so that they can become capably self-reliant and preparing a grand strategy for a major conflict. And this requires a discussion of structural violence and silence as a form of complicity. Meta. Focus must be on powerless groups whose voices are never heard. Invisible power is most insidious because it shapes the consciousness and beliefs which leads them to accept the status quo. Indivisible power operates in the context of structural violence embedded in daily life. If they are violent because they cause us harm, not that responsible for perpetuating them, lack of access to is exacerbated by unequal citizenship, millions of disenfranchised citizens. And part two. The rich-poor gap is racist. Wealthy European states design current global arrangements so they'd always dominate poor, darker people who have to depend on them for resources. Peg. Colonization of Africa by European powers was motivated by the desire to acquire wealth. Once in power, colonial rulers limited their colonies to commodity production. As a result, many African economies became dependent on exploitation of unprocessed goods. Dependence persists. Mining products account for 57% of sub-Saharan Africa's total exports. By comparison, they comprise only 13.2% of the world's trade. And the problem is still here. Resource appropriation from the global north keeps the south running on an endless treadmill as they constantly chase wealth, yet always stay in the same place. Gonzalez. The north, with 20% of the world's population, consumes 85% of the world's timber, 75% of its metals, and 60% of its food. The north consumption can only be maintained through appropriation of natural resources of the south. Overcompensation by one country requires the underconsumption by another. Worse, rich states back corrupt foreign leaders to secure their own interests. Henry. What made rich states rich and kept poor nations poor was the ongoing legacy of colonialism. Plunder thinly veiled as trade. The capitalist system is simultaneously generation of undevelopment as a part of development in others is possible, and because ruling elites in poor countries have something to gain from exploitation that are complicit at every level, resulting in cycles of repeated exploitation. In fact, developing state leaders often ignore their own people to serve themselves. Pogi. Many developing countries are also run by corrupt leaders unwilling to make serious poverty eradication efforts. Their ability to rule dependently being recognized by rich countries as entitled to borrow their country's name as with the proceeds of buy weapons and stay in power. The bad leadership, civil wars, widespread corruption in developing countries are strongly encouraged. Rulers have vastly more to gain from catering to wealthy foreign governments and from meeting the basic needs of their impoverished compatriots. That's the advocacy. Wealthy nations have a moral obligation, or have an obligation to provide development assistance to other nations. This entails that states with the highest combination of financial and produce assets and human resources offer monetary and human resources to the people in states lacking such resources. I support a grassroots approach model on the inter-American foundations which lets people dictate what they need. I have the right to clarifying process. Debon. The IF has fostered grassroots ownership of public processes that their donors might also wish to fund programs that support community processes. All projects should know the power of the local. Good policy is indispensable, but it needs a civic culture to keep it in the space of work. Knowledgeable and adaptable field staff are far more important for development than funding. Development is the capacity to devise and carry out one's own strategy. He adds, only after the community has defined its own problem, considered an alternative approach, and chosen amongst them should help be brought in. Programs should be high on technical capacity and flexibility and low on definition. Tailor-made should be the guideline, not off the rack. Donors will not develop in these countries. These countries will develop themselves. And the act burden is to justify the existence of an obligation to provide development assistance, not to show that it has specific effects. Possibility that an action can have an independent negative consequence and disprove the duty. Anymore, the violence in the civil rights movement de-justified MLK's marches. Gaworth. When there's a causal connection between some performing action and the other incurring harm, responsibilities removed if those intervene some other persons who intend to produce that harm. The intervening action is a direct cause of harm. MLK was told that because he led demonstrations in support of the civil rights, he was morally responsible for the riots that ensued. Cut the card there. Part 3. This is about what to do. Rich countries owe development assistance to countries they have poor. This is an extension of the negative duty not to harm, not a positive act of charity. Very 1. Consider the case for aid derived from claims by poor countries simply have been harmed by rich countries in the past by thinking about possible claims that African Americans could have made by their own white compatriots. The legacy of slavery still exists because even after slavery was abolished, there was continuous history of segregation which continues to this day. He adds its advantage and the oppressing be traced to wrongdoing in the past. Ex-colonial countries owe compensation to countries whose natural resources they stole without any payment to the people in the colony. Cut the card there. And rich states currently use poor ones at risk through environmental harm. Very 2. A basis for specific redress of the loss of agricultural production, living space causing global warming. Rich states played a large part in creating the problem and have resources to fix it and compensate those who have lost their possessions. The poorest developing countries will be hit the hardest by climate change, even though they've contributed little to the problem. Their low income makes it difficult people to finance adaptation. The international community has an obligation to support them in adapting climate change. He adds, we are looking for a cast iron case for aid. We have it here. Responsibility for causing loss carries an obligation to provide a remedy for those who have incurred the loss. Cut the card there. Next, rich states sustain dominance by making economic migration more difficult and thus have a compensatory duty to rectify the harm. Barry 3. One argument that motivates the obligation to aid by making accusation of wrongdoing on the part of rich countries that can be derived from the failure of rich countries to recognize the economic refugees parallel with that of political refugees for the fear of death, fear of disease, malnutrition, are just as compelling reasons for migrating as political persecution. There's absolutely no prospect that economic refugees will be accommodated by rich countries because the potential numbers are so enormous. 3 billion people live on less than $2 a day. If 10% were to move, that would be 300 million. Card there. Thus, a failure to act on the obligation to aid is complicity and injustice. Home. Rich nations enjoy advantages of globalization, but ignore poor countries. 3 million are deprived of at least one basic need. 800 million people went to bed hungry last night. 19,000 children will die today of easily preventable causes. We live in an affluent world. We produce enough food to feed the entire planet. We have the resources to meet everyone's basic needs. We're allocating just 1% of global wealth would eradicate extreme poverty at a stroke. Part 4. Underview. First, evaluate to using reasonability with the bright line of providing a solvency advocate. There are tons of teen trips with the next breed like their must spec in multiple countries or development assistance is only monetary. The app can hit these no matter how they define the terms. We should prefer a substantive debate bi-directional procedures. Second, for TM terms that maximize class, we debate this topic for 2 months and need interns that allow for more rather than less debate. Limiting national service to just one thing excludes many. Talk about interns that we can have only one app. That's differentiation means we have the same round every time. Air F on T to increase substantive debate. And I didn't read the last card.
Alright, that's fine. Are you good?
Yep.
Alright. Let's talk about your advocacy.
Sure.
So, what type of development aid do you provide?
Sure. So it's like monetary aid.
What's this about, like, the Inter-American Foundation? Like, what's that process?
Yeah,
like the
so,
grassroots.
Yeah, so that's people, or the organization that we're modeling it after. They had a grassroots ownership of public processes. Basically, the people in those countries or the nations that were getting aid were able to define what development was for them and what their needs were, and then through this organization, they were able to provide monetary aid.
So is it just like wealthy nations give like developing nations money and then they decide how to use that money to develop?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And it's like an exchange between nations?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about your framework.
Sure.
So what does it mean, or like how do we weigh impacts under your framework?
So like we look to autonomous liberation, right? So if you allow people to have the capacity to self-advocate and decide their own form of liberation.
So if we both advocate for things that are about autonomous liberation, like how do we resolve which one's better?
Well, like a normal debate. It would be under comparative worlds, so I would provide disads to your plan and you would provide disads to mine probably.
Okay. Can we talk about the environment stuff?
Sure.
So why does development aid solve like the harms?
Sure. So it talks about how rich states right now are currently putting poor ones at risk through environmental harm. They're creating this dependence on them and increasing global warming. It also talks about how rich countries are the least affected by global warming, but they're the main cause of it, which is bad. So I'm saying you basically need to rectify that harm by giving compensatory development assistance.
So a lot of the arguments in the AFRA about like why developed nations have like harmed underdeveloped nations,
Yeah.
right? And so that's a reason why we should prefer development aid.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about the underview.
Sure.
Why do we need to prefer interps that maximize clash?
Sure. So the warrant in here is we only debate it for 2 months, and we should probably have more rather than less debate, limiting it to just like one type of development assistance.
Why is the app
really
good
bad.
for clash?
Well, I'd say it's good for clash because like it's not necessarily like it's not abusive, right? You're able to provide disads for it. I'm not like trying to exclude offense. I just really want to have a substantive debate.
Okay.
Like it's a pretty generic app.
Sure. Let's talk about this Glenbrooks card. Can you just
Sure.
explain the warrant?
Sure. So it talked about how people were trying to de-justify the civil rights movement by saying that it caused riots. Obviously, that doesn't mean that the civil rights movement in and of itself was a bad thing. It just means the riots that ensued were bad, right? So, like, it means that you can have a good thing and, like, promote a good thing, like the civil rights movement, and just because of some negative unintended consequence, that doesn't de-justify that action.
So does the app just defend intentions?
It is intentions-based,
Okay.
yeah.
147. I'm gonna email the doc.
Okay.
Okay, I just sent it, so let me know. Good. Are you ready? Are you good? Oh, and it's 2 off case. Framework individuals can never be self-enclosed because always exposed to others, even separating yourself off from other people. You still to find a relation to community. If you enclose yourself against another boundary, and that boundary always ends up being the community. This means you can't think of the individual without vulnerability because they always have that enclosure may. The being of individuals' exposure to outside nature design any conception of the community is interaction between pre-constituted individuals' logic will imply that the separation of separate enclosures, the separation must be enclosed. The closure must close around territorial being exposed and outer of the territory. Exposure is necessarily a constitutive aspect of individuals. The closure cannot close around itself without losing its characteristics as the closure and nostalgic. Communities are based on creating community statements where there's one unified quality that defines whether you're in the community or not. So we must render communities inoperable by embracing community based around difference. James, the community's experience through a mode of dislocation exists of society as an organized entity itself. This experience as corruption in community. Urban community is essentially nostalgic term seen as what is lost in the modern experience of the social essence of modern conception of community. As said, that understanding communal as immediacy of self-presence by projecting and invert the assumptions impossible the totalizing experience of the what might be lost community separation of entities that are in common in community. The community exceed the principle of identity or any figure of totality. Thus, these standards to embrace the operative community prefer. Additionally, one creating communities based on difference can only result in death because they seek to get rid of anyone who doesn't conform. May 2. Language of community is part of its common substance. Any project is a goal of formation of the community of eminence is a project of death. Common substance is a loser community is not a consistent transcendence of being. By inverting the principle, we get totalitarianism. Exemplar is not to charity is terminated. Anyone who is not eminent to the organic community comes to the need for community in terms of common substance is to fail to recognize that their conception can only be realized in death. Offense, the concept of nation is defined as a group of people that are unified by some common identity, history, birth, states, now practice that furthers the goal determined by the nation. This construction reduces the identity of individuals down to simple objective code in order to incorporate them into homogeneous nationhood, precludes the possibility of change or formation of individual identities. The endorsement of using nations to provide development aid is the link. Nancy, the nation is the people who defines a common will and institutes itself as to operate or common purpose. The common can be conceived as the will or produced by history. The invention is blurred. Nations have under people the invention as blurred identity of the people by inventing itself as the recognizable by the civil status and associated identification from person pertains to identity recognizable. The point of intersection is a singular path that people have become nations or less capable of new beginnings. They will ground with less susceptible to create new past civil status have become new soul identities subscribed to anyone national identity modulates in the simplest manner and is best suited to contemporary and future needs societies. Next up. Interpretation, the alpha specify target nation to receive development aid. Violation, you don't specify, you just say in general we should give it to other nations. Boneg 1. The core feature of development aid is that varies depending on target nation. For LOVA 10. Development aid may have a positive impact on growth. Other studies given that foreign aid have effects on countries vulnerable to external shocks. Some assume that aid have positive impacts, but not in the topics. It's impossible to find whether development aid has a positive or negative impacts on growth in developing countries. Every country has different characteristics influencing the impact of aid, which is not permitted to broad generalizations. 2x A, resolvability. The browser is resolvable against target nation because we can't evaluate the effects of aid. Independent voter because one needs to win or outweighs a magnitude absent target country. There's zero risk of gaining any form of engagement. So I don't know my arguments. And also, link turns argument about clash. And so the argument is that you don't gain any clash unless there's ability for me to engage in that in the first place to be ground. I don't know what competes or links with the absent target country specifically outweighs this happen moves and then coordinate grounds like so link turns. I can't understand scope of implementation of the plan, so I can't contest whether it's also unique key against this because absent link turns only route to the offenses. You can literally helping people about key to fairness society need ground to make arguments TV themselves. They can still defend their authorship to spec more so that abuse and non-unique also takes out the first spec. First spec says that the Berlin should be solvency. I think I say that's fine if you have a solvency active, but you still need to specify more even in the present that, which means it's unreasonable and it's unreasonable for her to defend that interpretation. Also, vote on parents because basically given that needs rules in education, that's why schools find use competing interpretations between vote is arbitrary cause intervention is definitionally unfair to the debater. A deters future abuse empirically confirmed operators and B dropping the argument on using career because dropping the advocacy so functions saying no arguments A creates showing the fact of is dangerous theory because they get to put long kind of one air and two cops away and conventionally next always be some bias from theory against good theory to basically implement abuse all standards and B the logical unfair but doesn't make any sense logical first in theory since all arguments need to make sense in order to be valuable. Also, you can't cross apply like impact terms from the AC because the theory showed dice your ability to be the AC in the first place, which means that's impossible for me to know whether AC is true unless you have unless the interpret is true. on case. This counterplan operates under your framework, so this is a reason as to if you win your role of the ballot, then it's a reason why you prefer this counterplan. The counterplan is to reject the framing of the AF as a development assistance in favor of reparations. South we do the AF plan, but frame it as reparations rather than development assistance, which still engages in the same material act, just redefines a non-net benefit. Framing the AF as development is an extension of colonialism that gains traction. Ideal human progress uses civilization as a prophecy to justify destruction of previous indigenous cultures, then encourages negligence to violence of past colonialism. Nair 99 bracketed for grammar. Development expresses bringing civilization to the world so much that failure may be arrested. Their new commitment to carry on developments, minister admonishments for past failures, encouragements for future hope, processes of remembering are accompanied by equally important processes of forgetting. Now once colonialism was blatant, now it takes place under guise of globalized development. The poorest become to replace the savage, the ideological weapons of desired condition, creating orders of inhumanity with violence. Intact development requires conditions that facilitates implementation, ensure obedience, systematic infliction. The order secures proved to be ideological weapons, systematic infliction of violence. Passing has the legitimizing claim for a necessity of violent of ordering of security purposes, fashion, colonialism, communism, capitalism, counterplan solves reparations, recognize how wealthy nations and force non-wealthy nations into position through a history of exploitation of reparations, warn this history and law for the solace of insufficiency projects like the AF project. Also, her AF literally justifies as to why developed nations have wronged underdeveloped nations in the past, which is a reason that's why reparations would be a better form of recognizing that. McIver 10. Reparation is the basis for collective life in the wake of a shared trauma. The work of mourning creates the condition of reparation by affecting cognitive appreciation for the dilemmas of collective life by integrating these but all features of our subjective and social inheritance, comparing the traumas that form collective identity. This often only applies under your role about then just general terms. So, or actually go to the framework first. One point is that an operative community constrains how your world about operates, because you say that we need autonomous ways in order to create liberation, but no, the argument is that you constantly homogenize people into the same liberation strategies, because you say that when you and that an operative community is the only way for us to create new changes and difference. For example, it says that we should be based on difference. Also, 2 is that an operative community also constrains the way that we should talk about the person versus, i.e., the arguments that you've made in the AC are not consistent with how we should actually discuss in the first place. That means that it constrains also fairness to prerequisite to your role of valid, because it's a question of in order to gain education versus fairness is a prerequisite to actually being able to have equal standing grounds in order to discuss in the first place. Then also on the contention. First, development assistance turned development assistance imperialist and functions to turn nations to Western stages of a pain of forced coup. Turns case Leah 1580 is an important function of Western imperialism. The function is used by to subsidize the operations of West aid. Was used by governments to ensure that governments receive the money, adopt policies that favor interests of the corporation, that demand privatization, sell off public assets, the removal of controls on imports. Is aid agencies to support only poor Western repressive governments. Some of the products of U.S. coups were patriotic and sovereign governments try to protect and develop their own industries and provide the well-being of their people, are vilified by the West and become targets of uprising, coups, and invasion plan and organized with the financially intelligent or agencies. Then on the underview first, overview first. Your argument about more cautious. Your arguments about substantive education are precluded by theory shell, because the theory shell says that in order to have some sort of productive substantive education, you need to actually spec in the first place. That's the reason as to why theory comes before your ability to engage in substantive education. I read everything in the doc.
Yep. Okay, ready for projects? Okay, starting now. Let's talk about theory. What could you not read as a result of me reading this half?
What do you mean?
Like, specifically on the ground standard. What could you not read?
Oh, sure. So, if I was to read, specific disads, i.e., the Africa disad, which is, African wars, right? It would be impossible to know, because for a LOVA card justifies why development aid would be different, have different effects on every society. So, disads that depend on, economic growth or economic, or the opposite of growth.
Sure. So I talked about monetary assistance. Why does that mean that you can't?
No. So monetary assistance is different in every nation, right? For example, monetary assistance would have a different effect on the countries that you implement it in, which is impossible.
Okay, any plan would have a different effect in any country. Why does that mean that my app specifically is bad?
It means that your app didn't specify which countries we should assist. And you also talk about how developed countries have wronged underdeveloped countries. It seems like you should, in that relationship, you should spec what sort of countries we've wronged and what sort of countries we should give help to.
Okay, it says here in your card that it's impossible to define whether development aid has positive or negative effects on growth in developing countries. Why does this matter insofar as the app is just trying to prove an obligation?
Sure. So the argument is that you're still excluding core net ground, right? For example, if I wanted to read a util framework and then I wanted to read some disads, that would exclude that. And the second point is that it's still, that's based under your framing, right? But I still need the ability to, discuss, for example, if there's negative effects, then that might mean that we don't have an obligation, right? So it's the way, that's, just under the app framework.
Sure. Let's talk about your framework. What does it mean mean to have an inoperative community?
Sure. I think James is pretty good on that issue. So there's a nostalgic community, which is basically a community where it's based around like one shared identity, one shared quality.
Sure.
And then the inoperative community is a community based on difference. Like it's the acceptance
So
that
what
it's
does that look like?
Sure. So the inoperative community would be a community, i.e., like people lined up to go on the bus, right? Nothing binds them except in that moment they're all about to go on the bus, right?
Okay, so how does the AC mean that we can't have these inoperative communities?
Sure. The AC excludes difference from its concept. So I think the non-state card was under the offense explains that. So it's basically a reason that's why, so long as you defend the concept of nations, that's going to be worse because nation is defined as a group of people who are unified based on a common identity or history. Like the endorsement of that concept.
Why is that true of all places?
What? No, like using the nation, the concept of nation defines people as like having common identity. That's like the definition of what nation is.
Why does it matter under your framework if people can be like all in the line for the bus, but they're all in one place at the exact same time? Like
No,
then they're all in
that's-
that place.
But
Why
it's
is
like
that
it's a
not binding?
recognition that's like an ephemeral similarity, right?
What is
like
an ephemeral similarity?
Like it's not a similarity that lasts throughout time. An inoperative community means that we recognize that it's impossible to have a community based on a single identity. Rather, we accept that it's difference, like it's based around people's differences, right?
Sure. Alright, starting prep now. I went in. I'll send a speech down.
Okay.
theory, or NC, counterplan F.
Wait, sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah. So theory, NC, CP, F.
Cool.
Okay, everyone ready? Okay. Okay, starting now. First counterinterpretation, the F must pick a target nation to receive development assistance if their offense is contingent on that nation. For because I only have to provide an obligation. Also, none of my arguments are specific to any specific nation ever having anything, which means that she's not losing any ground or resolvability. So it's resolving all the impacts or first resolvability that rounds are irresolvable because the absent target countries we can't evaluate the effects of aid. But this doesn't matter because none of my offense is contingent on that. All you have to do is disprove the obligation, and then you are fine. This is under a consequentialist based thing, so it doesn't make any sense. Also, you can turn this back because it makes it more resolvable if you're able to just disprove the obligation and go through every single country. This also incentivizes a race at the bottom in terms of specificity. People will become more and more specific under this standard, developing the smallest target nations or completely random nations that you couldn't prep out, which means you'd have to prep out literally every single nation the app could be, which would make the round irresolvable and make too much ground, which would be bad for things like Clash, because we wouldn't be able to specifically you wouldn't be able to have specific clashes if you have to do that much research on the topic. Also, specifically off of ground, she said she doesn't know it competes with the links or it's the app absent a target country, but this means that you could just read pics of the app if I'm determining if I'm doing every single app in general, or if I'm supporting every nation in general. That means you could just pick out of any single one, which is probably good for you in terms of ground, and it also means we can have more specific clash about those individual countries, so your ground would be fine on there. Also, she's making arguments for why we should vote on fairness, but both my arguments link to that. She says, drop the debater, but to deter future abuse, empirically confirmed with a prioris, for example. But no, first, that's not going to stop me from reading this app in the future. So you shouldn't drop the debater on this. You should just drop the argument. Her second is not dropping the RNTs, and coherent is dropping the app advocacy. So it's functionally the same, but that doesn't make any sense. You can drop any arguments on the app that are specific to one nation, or get offense from one nation instead of just dropping me in general. Yeah, fine, I'm not going to go for an RPA. Let's go to the NC. She says we need to create these inoperative communities, but my framework can co-opt this first because able to have autonomous liberation, that means you look to the specific people in the first place, which means that they are able to define their own liberation. They're able to define what their own inoperative community is. They're able to break these barriers. If people aren't being heard because other things in education, other people are overpowering them, that means they can never create these inoperative communities because certain people or certain structures are forcing them into one particular community, which is necessarily bad. That means my framework is a prerequisite to this. Off of her Nancy card, she's saying that the nations, people and nations are united by a common identity. But first, you can turn the app gives people the ability to create inoperative communities by because right now people are unified by bad experiences or bad shared experiences that's shown by all the colonization arguments under the AC. If we try to rectify some of those, that means people can break out of these non-synologic communities, actually frame them, and create operative communities. So the app is the first step to this actually happening. Go to the CP. First, offer the argument. You can permanently the app. The app is literally kind of reframe it, what it means to have development assistance or changes, and no longer connotates oppression and colonialism. Also, off the MacIver card, nothing in this card says development assistance cannot do that. And second, there's a contradiction between the arguments we ought to take from policy action and changing reps. Reject her because she is just stealing my entire app. This is a performative reason to drop her. She is doing exactly what the wealthy nations have done. They have co-opted the history and the culture of people and claimed it as their own. Go off her Leah argument. This is just inherency for the app. It says foreign aid right now is bad. That's why I'm changing it. Go to the part 3. Extend Barry 1. This is about what to do. Rich countries owe development assistance countries. They kept poor. This is an extension of the negative duty not to harm, not a positive act of charity. And the Barry 2, that rich countries are currently putting poor ones at risk to environmental harm. This means that they have this obligation. At the end of the day, as long as you think I'm proving this obligation, then you affirm. Also, extend the role of that to have autonomous liberation. She says I'm homogenizing people through liberation strategies, but these liberation strategies are key to breaking down these inoperative framings in the first place. So it's try or die.
Did you read all of these reasons or just the first one?
No, I read the first one and then the second two.
Okay.
Off the MacArthur.
So you didn't read the second permanent?
Yeah.
Okay. Hold on. How much script do I have? 147. it's going to be an overview. You can fill it at the top of the app, and then it'll be the theory debate, the NC, the counterplan AC. Is everyone ready? I'm just going to go for the counterplan, but she has done a really bad job explaining why the AC reframes development assistant, which means solo, and that was the only argument she's made on the link, which is definitely also a reason as to why the link would be an independent turn to the AC so long, and you do not have a clear explanation for why she has reframed development assistance, then she definitely links to why development assistance is colonialist, and that's a reason that's why the AC would be a bad idea. Then we can go to line by line. First on theory debate, she doesn't have any offense on theory. I can see that her role development comes before theory, which is a reason that's why you should evaluate it there. And she doesn't go for the RBI. So then on the NC. First, I'm just going to go for the Nancy card as a turn under the ACD. Your only argument says that they're united by common identity, but we need to rectify in order for them to break out of them. But no, the argument is that by combining them to a nation, that necessarily necessitates that you have to find them as a group of people with a common substance or a common identity. That's a reason as to why you're using like wealthy nations to help poor nations. Those poor nations are a form of like homogenizing them into one type of identity or a static conception of what an essentialized identity. That's going to be uniquely worse, which means that you have to embrace, which is a reason as to why it would be an independent turn under the AC, because it's a question of why, how you've not been able to give them autonomous operations since they are always confined with the identity of the nation. Now I'm going to do the line by line work on the counterplan. First, your only response to Nancy literally says that the A's do the alpha as the counterplan, but no, you don't reframe development assistance. For example, you still assume that the other nations need to be developed. You still say that we should give them money so that they can change themselves in order to fit our ideals of what a nation should, what an ideal nation should look like. That's a reason as why you have not redefined it. For example, your advocacy card literally says that we should give them money so that they can change themselves. And you say that. I'll read your line from the card. Your argument says that development is the capacity. Development is levels of funding that actually allow them to develop themselves. That's the reasons why you have made a reason why they are inferior and they need to develop themselves and they need the assistance or they need to be dependent on other nations in order to create that to raise themselves up from the inferiority in the first place. That's a reason as why you have definitely linked into the narrow card. The narrow card is going to be really explicit on this issue. The first line is literally about why development expresses civilization of the world, which is a reason as to why even if you try to say the next picture, you're going to stand up and say that the AC development system isn't the same, but no, you literally give them money so that they can change themselves to the norms of the Western world, and that's an argument that you've conceded from the layer card, which is that you have necessarily forced them to conform to Western ideals. That's a definite reason as to why you link. You haven't read any other perms, and also there's no net benefit to the perm, i.e. the counterplan would be better on its own because it has all of the material impacts of the AC and none of the harms. So let's go to the text, the MacGyver card. Your only response on this first is that you say that there's no reason why development assistance can't do the same thing, but no, the argument is that reparations is the only way to recognize the trauma of and the history of exploitation. For example, development assistance just glosses over the exploitation and just tries to force them into the current conceptions of what it means to be current conceptions of what it means to be good, but reparations actually more in this history and recognize that there is a debt to be paid back to these countries after the wrongs that have been done previously. Then your second argument says that there's a contradiction between arguments that we ought to take a different policy action and changing representations, and you say that you should reject me because I'm stealing crap, but no, this is not. First is that this is not a performative reason to drop me because I'm not stealing your AC. I'm reframing what it means. I use like a different method to do your app. That's definitely not stealing your AC. For example, you're basically saying that no one can advocate for development assistance other than you, but no, the argument to true point is that you say that I'm doing what wealthy nations have done, but no, the argument is that I'm not stealing your arguments for it. I'm rather reframing how you should have done it in the first place, i.e. it's just a not better way to do it. And also you say that then on the contradictions argument specifically, you say that we have to take a different, the changing representations are key to actually changing policy action in the first place. For example, the changing representations shapes how we pass that policy in the first place, i.e. the type of mindset that people have towards the policy in the first place. That's definitely a reason that's why you should prefer changing these representations in the method first. Then on the layer card, This is also an independent turn under her framework because the argument says that development assistance is imperialist, which turns nations into Western stages, into Western ideals. For example, the card warns us, you have not responded. So you just say that it doesn't. You say that you've changed foreign aid, but this is premised around your explanation of why it has changed in the first place. So there's no reason as to why your Inter-American Foundation, you're going to try to say it's about grassroots movements, but no, you still create dependency on the wealthy nations in order to actually provide that in the first place. You have not clearly extended a reason as to why developing nations forcing intervention to other countries is not a part of the AC. Then also you're going to try to go for this argument as to why consequences don't matter, but no, the argument in the economic plan is that the discourse or the actual concept of development in the first place is going to be bad. So it's a question of the way that you frame the round as development, which is necessarily necessitates that there is an underdeveloped in contrast to developed, which is a reason that's why you reject the AC. All right, round's going to be really clear. You can vote under her framework, but there's going to be 3 clear turns, and then the counterplan is going to resolve the harms of the AC. So the counterplan is that we should we should give aid to countries as form of reparations instead of development assistance, because the term development in that discourse implies that there's an underdeveloped that needs to be developed into Western norms. That is the Leah and Nair cards. That's a reason as to why you're going to prefer the counterplan. Her perm doesn't matter. The perm has no warrant. It just says that you reframe development assistance. She does not explain how you reframe development assistance. She just asserts that. But development assistance still implies that there's some change that needs to occur in those nations. Rather, we say that we should give them money with no strings attached. It doesn't say you have to change yourself. It just says that we should give them reparations. And even if you don't buy the counterplan, you still buy Nair, Leah, and Nancy as 3 independent turns under her framework as to why she's imperialist. So, right there.
Okay. 110 starting now. Okay. Starting CP and CAC. Is everyone ready? Okay. Starting now. It's bad that the only strategy you went for was literally advocating for the app. Extend the perm to the app. The app literally is the counterplan. We reframe what it means to have development assistance and change it so that it no longer connotes the oppression and colonialism. Her main critique of my app is that I'm not allowing for local voices to be heard, for these people to define what their own conception of development is. Well, you messed it up. That's exactly what the app is saying. She attempts to quote my my advocacy card, and says the wrong thing. I literally define it as development is the capacity to devise and carry out one's own strategy only after the community has defined its own problem, considered alternative approaches chosen amongst them. Should experts and other help from Western nations be brought in? I also clarified in cross-text that it was purely monetary and that these people get to define what development is for them, meaning that they get to define their own needs. This is literally what the app is. That's off the Nancy card as well. Also, extend the first response and make either that there is nothing in this card that says development assistance cannot do that. She's saying that hers is specifically good because it says reparations are good, but it doesn't say that development assistance is bad. Also, you can extend the argument there is an inherent contradiction between arguments that we have to take a different policy action and changing representation. You should reject her because she is stealing my entire app. It's a performative reason to drop her. She is doing exactly what wealthy nations have done. They have co-opted the history and cultures of people and claimed it as their own. The app talks about how wealthy nations have historically gone into other nations and created conditions that led to corrupt regimes or dependence or bad things that foreign aid is causing right now. Since the app is a step away from that, it's necessarily good, and it also means that picking out of a word in the app is doing the exact same thing performatively, and that is a reason to drop her. Her one argument to this is that she's reframing my entire AC, and her second argument is that she's not stealing. She's just reframing. No, that is literally not true. You are picking out of a single word in the AC and claiming that is reframing, even though that is the exact same thing that the AF is. So it doesn't make any sense. Go on to her Leo card. She's just sending it and says it's premised around my explanation of foreign aid in the first place, but first this is inherency for the AF. If you look at any of the harms cards, it talks about how current foreign aid is imperialist. If you get these people to define their own definition of what development is, and that doesn't, there's no link to that. Sorry, I'm going to skip the order, but go to Barry 1 on the AF. Extend Barry 1, this is about what super-rich countries owe development assistance to countries that have kept poor. It's an extension of the negative duty not to harm, not a positive act of charity. And Barry 2, that rotates currently put poor at risk through things like environmental harms, which is necessarily bad. Go to the NC real quick. She's extending Nancy and saying that this is a independent turn, a reason to draw me. Not true. It applies to the counterplan as well, so it's non-unique at best, but she's also ignoring the turn that I make that the AF gives people the ability to create in operative communities. People are unified by bad experiences right now, and being able to get out of those nations requires things like monetary assistance or their own conception of development so that they're able to break out of these inoperative communities. That means that functions as a net benefit to the PERM. Okay, places you can vote. The counterplan is the same thing as the AF. He's critiquing these Western notions and Western impositions. That is literally not what the AF is. The wealthy nations just provide money to these people. So if you can't find a difference between the AF and the counterplan, you vote AF. Goodbye.
Do you mind deleting my email?
Yes.
And I'll show you that I'm doing
Yeah,
this.
can you delete mine too?
Yeah. So here and then. Where did that come up? That's where I lost it. Oh, here we go. Yeah.
Trash. And then
Okay, thanks.
Just have to settle for a second.
okay.
shoes, by the way. Oh, thank you.
Okay. I voted no. I realized that the more I judged, the more I realized that I don't really know very many things. So, these are my thoughts. So I don't know how this compares to others. Like, I think perhaps maybe I have a low threshold for net benefits and high threshold for perms compared to others. But honestly, I have no idea where my threshold compares to others because I don't know what other people think. So I get around thinking, okay, so the outcomes, like the actual consequences of implementation of the app and the PIG are probably largely similar. But there's some chance that the colonialist rhetoric of the app could taint the outcomes, but I don't think that argument is very well developed by the neg. Like, I don't think you ever tie them directly to each other. So that's something. But I do think there's a difference between the rhetoric of the app and the PIG, and I think that it would be a whole lot clearer for me if your entire And I was like, it's not about whether they are functionally the same, it's the words we attach to them and what kind of baggage those words carry with them. So you get to this kind of like after you've extended the entire pick, and then you're like, okay, it's about the words. I think if changing that up and having that story the whole time would have made me less confused. So then I'm thinking, okay, so if reparations definitely does not have a negative connotation, meaning there's no disadd to the pick, then why would we not use it? Because there's no disadd to the pick. But if there's a risk that development is based on some kind of colonialist mindset of instilling inferiority versus superiority, which I think, as a side note, an interesting discussion would have been the difference in that colonialist mindset when it's the people deciding that they have a problem as opposed to someone external saying they have a problem. I think that could have been, so Lauren, when you bring up the fact that they're deciding what they want to develop on, I think you can link that to being like, so it's not based in some kind of colonialist mindset. I mean, I think there are arguments on both sides for that, but I think that discussion could have gone further. But, so then I'm thinking if there's a risk that development, that term, is based in something that's colonialist and instills inferiority versus superiority, then why would we use it if there's another option that does not have a disadvantage? So that to me points towards voting for the pick. So that's what I did. I think that there are ways that you could make the perm more developed in the 1AR, because it is more developed in the 2AR, it's just a clearer interaction. And I don't think those interactions are new necessarily, because they are reacting to the NR kind of articulations or comparisons. But I think if you would have done more to like point out like these functionally are reparations, because I think some of the examples you bring up in the 2AR are more like obviously reparations, whereas in the 1AR you kind of like you glaze over them just because of time, but like they're there. But I think that if you would have made the argument in the 1AR or even in the 2AR that it's not about the words, it's about the actual outcomes, which I'm not sure is true because you have this obligations argument, and that could have also had an interesting interaction with the pick that didn't really go anywhere. So that could have been a whole other thing. But yeah, you go more for the like negative duty not to harm environmental stuff in the 1AR. Yes, I just think the next should be more specific, that it's about the like actual words and what's attached to them, like what history is there and how they can go, like your cards talk more about like the like process of recognizing trauma, stuff like that. I think that could have been more in the extensions. And then the I think further developing the term and talking about how if the actions are functionally the same, the labels we ascribe to them don't matter. And then I think that you can, so since the neg concedes your framing in the NR, I think that you can do some contextualization under your framing, because that's also something I'm missing at the end. I'm like, okay, we've conceded the AF framing that I haven't really heard except for like a little bit in the 1AR, and now I'm deciding at the end of the round based on this framing I haven't heard in 15 minutes. So I think that could have been another opportunity for you in the 2AR, that you just get to like decide what the framing is now, because she concedes it and doesn't contextualize it under her impacts very much. The other thing I wanted to mention, so the whole like co-opting performance contradiction. I think that the way that you would win this argument is if you won the perm, because then you would win that they are literally the same. But if you won the perm, then you wouldn't need to win the performance co-opt argument. So I see why you went for it, and I would have gone for it too. But ultimately, I don't think it gets you very much in the end. And then your argument about the like operative communities and how you create operative communities. I don't see how that plays into a lot of things either, based on the fact that she's kicking her framework and I'm not seeing the impact back to your framework. So again, I think both of you in the rebuttals should talk about the frame. Like, yes, it's a conceded framework, but I need to know how impacts interact under that framework. So I think the negative talking about why the rhetoric, will highlight why the rhetoric is so important under the framework, and perhaps the app highlight why, like, no, the sense of obligation is more important, and somehow that means rhetoric doesn't matter? Yes, those are my thoughts. Questions?
It made sense to me.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.